Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
To all who shall see these presents, greetings. On behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brutecast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Nate Janikin, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. We will also be recording this webcast for the benefit of those in our community of interest who could not join us today, so we ask that you keep your own webcams off to help us stream smoothly. At the conclusion of our discussion, we'll have a question and answer session, so if you have a question, just type it into the group chat, and I'll go through them in the order received. So this episode is going to be a continuation of our mini-series focused on partnerships. In our first episode, we talked with the Chilean Marine Corps, and now we jump across the pond to the United Kingdom. Understanding how and why our partners fight gives us the ability to be a better coalition members as planners, leaders, and followers. So today we have a member from the United Kingdom's Land Warfare Center to talk about what it does and its role in the British Army. And for those out in the Marine Corps, it's going to be a little bit of CDI, a little bit of TCOM. And for the U.S. soldiers out there, it's going to sound a little bit like TRADOC with some of its own features. So our guest today is Warrant Officer Class 2 Paul Barnes. He's a staff officer within the UK Land Warfare Center's Warfare Branch, which develops and produces United Kingdom's land doctrine. His focus is on the higher level national and multinational doctrine. He's the Secretary of NATO's Senior Land Doctrine Panel and lead of the ABCA NZ's Maneuver Doctrine Project Team, and is a CGS and CAS fellow and a former fellow at both RUSI and the Modern War Institute at West Point. So, Paul, welcome to the episode, and we'll kick it over to you for your opening comments.
Thank you, Paul. So, thank you very much for having me. It's really good to be able to engage with people about this subject, because it's something that people don't necessarily know too much about. What I'm going to do is, first of all, is run through. There's an awful lot to cover, but I'm going to run through where we've come to, why we have a Land Warfare Centre, and what it does. So Land Warfare Centre was formed a few years ago when we broke up what was the Army Recruiting and Training Directorate into two parts. So it became Army Recruiting and Initial Training Command and Land Warfare Centre. So what the Land Warfare Centre does is essentially take those people who've come through recruit training, initial training, and gives them trade training. To give you some idea of the size of the unit, the size of the command, if you like, they carry out 159 initial trade training courses every year, and they cover 1,289 other courses per year. So it's an enormous number of courses of education. So the main emphasis is in training. I mean, so the mission statement is that Land Warfare Centre is to deliver collective training and trade training and drive agile adaptation of the field army to enable success on current and future operations. So largely it's a training piece, and we'll talk a bit about training now. And then there's the part that I work in, which is warfare and warfare development, and I'll cover that later. So essentially, how it's broken up, it's commanded by Major General Chris Barry, who is Director Land Warfare, and it's broken up into a series of pillars which help the headquarters to work. And we have a command pillar, no surprises, it does command. A support pillar that provides admin support to it, a resources pillar that covers budgets, etc., all that sort of administrative stuff. And then we have an operate pillar, which is responsible for collective training, training support, simulation, those sorts of things. A business center that provides business management information, so that metrics, etc. And then we have training plans, and they carry out mission-specific training, multinational training, sort of pre-deployment training. That's their piece. Then we have our little area, which is not training. Our little area is warfare, so that's doctrine and warfare development, lessons, which includes training lessons, operational lessons, historical lessons, and indeed lessons from other conflicts. So conflicts going on around the world. For instance, they produce papers very regularly on the situation in Ukraine, and indeed have started to produce papers on Gaza, which are really excellent. And then we have the operational research branch, and they carry out research, gathering data, providing sort of really in-depth scientific data to assist in deciding, what will be the future of different types of warfare and the future of different sorts of weapon systems. And they're really tied into experimentation. I'll flick on to the operate group because to give you the idea of the scale and what sort of training goes on, and then we'll come back to some issues. But the sort of scale of the training, they run a collective training group, which is a global training, and that is training that takes place in places like Belize and in Brunei, but also in places like Kenya and Germany and all over the UK. So in all the places where the British Army has a substantive presence that goes on for some time, there's obviously large amounts of collective training. There's also training of specific arms and areas. So all the artillery training is collected at the Royal School of Artillery in Lark Hill on Salisbury Plain in the south of England. We have the Royal School of Mechanical Engineering, which covers all military engineering. Sorry, military engineering, not mechanical engineering. They'll hate that. Royal School of Military Engineering, that's at Chatham, which is in Kent, near London. We have the Defence College of Logistics, Personnel Administration, which is just the other side of Salisbury Plain, again in the south of England. And that covers all logistics, policing, administration. We have the Army Air Corps Centre, at Middle Wallop, again not too far away from us, which covers all aspects of aviation. And then we have the Combat Manoeuvre Centre, which is based in Warminster, covers all infantry and armour training. We have the Land Command and Staff College, which covers all officer education. So everything from everything after initial training. So everything when they leave Sandhurst, which is our sort of military academy, they come to their regiments, they do their stuff, and after a few years, they go off to do some staff training, and that builds up to sort of intermediate staff college, which they do under the Army's auspices after a short period. But that covers officers from the ranks of lieutenant to major. And then we have the experimentation and trials group, and they are really working on equipment and techniques that may take off in the future. People will say robot dogs, that sort of thing. We say that with a sort of tongue in the cheek, but that is the sort of thing that they are working with to see what the future of robotics, etc., will do for the battlefield. So initially, that's sort of the breakdown of what we do and why we do it. And so we are mainly a training command with an element that does doctrine and gathering of lessons, etc. And the two things are very deeply interconnected. So the idea is that by picking lessons up from other conflicts or from training or from operations, we can adjust the doctrine, and the doctrine can adjust the training. In other words, it's an iterative process that's picking lessons out, that adjusts doctrine, that adjusts training, that picks lessons out and adjusts and adjusts. So it's like a virtual circle. So that's why we're all hosted together. Now, Director Land Warfare has three key themes that he's working on at the moment, which are largely resulting from some major changes that we've all seen wherever we are in the world over the last few years. His first key theme is called protecting the license to operate. what we see in training particularly, training has to be really robust. Obviously, our soldiers need to be trained to a high pitch of readiness. They need to be prepared to train in a realistic way, and that puts people in positions where they could be injured, or puts people in a position where, looking from the outside, from a civilian perspective, one might say that, was that training absolutely necessary? Was that training safe? Not safe, because no military training can be, completely safe. People are running around with weapons, and heavy metal is tearing around while they're doing it. But it has to be within reason safe enough that we've managed the risk safe enough. And so that's really his top priority, because if we don't protect our license to operate, the government, the government allowing us to be able to train our people in a really effective way, then we cease to be an effective army, because without the training there's no basis to it. So his key priority is protecting the license to operate. The second one comes about from the last 20 odd years of the deployments to places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And that really is what we call closing the combined arms maneuver capability gap. What's happened over the last 20 years, obviously, was that the British Army, which is not large by US standards, at about 73,000 personnel, but I mean, it started off probably close to 100,000 20 years ago, and we've seen it sliced down to 73 now. But the problem was that over that time, the amount of people having to deploy to those locations, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., meant that all the training, everything was focused on that campaign. That was actually given a title, Op Entirety, and the whole army was really focused on counterinsurgency warfare, the ability to deploy on those operations. So almost the entire army at stages was in a position where you were either deploying, or coming back from deployment, or supporting deployment. So in other words, everybody was entirely focused. Now, the downside of that was that for 20 years, effectively, the British Army had very limited chance to train for its warfighting role, which meant that combined arms maneuver, as was at the time, sort of slipped away from our focus. So I remember being on exercise in Canada in 2002, and really working up to a real high pitch of combined arms fighting. I was with an infantry regiment, and we were working alongside our Royal Tank Regiment friends in Challenger tanks, but also having the support of the Royal Artillery, and also the support of fast air, and it was all very, very joined up, and people knew how to plan for that. Fast forward 20 years, that is less and less the case, and COVID was probably the thing that really knocked it for six, because not only were we already in a position where we weren't really training for combined arms maneuver, but when COVID came in, we couldn't even keep up with individual training, which meant we have a small but important generation of people who have very limited experience of any military training at all, let alone combined arms maneuver training. And the lessons coming out of Ukraine and elsewhere all point to the importance of combined arms maneuver, that you must fight in that combined arms system. You cannot fight individual elements on their own. I mean, if you put a tank out in front of it without infantry support, it's going to get killed. And so you need to combine, and we need to get round to that. So they recognize the combined arms maneuver capability gap, and so we're busily trying to close it. That, I would say, if I'm absolutely honest, is probably the most important element in training, trying to get people back to the high pitch of readiness and professionalism they had prior to um, operations overseas in support of counterinsurgency campaigns. And then the final one of the of DLW's key themes is transforming at the pace of relevance. So the pace of relevance is a horrible phrase, I always think. What it means essentially is transforming as fast as we have to transform, which might seem just like whether we just call it transformation. Probably we should. But what we're trying to do is provide the training for the new weapon systems, new platforms, new ways of fighting, well in advance of the arrival of those things, so that people are ready to be able to fight in terms of war fighting. So what are we looking at in terms of that? Well, you know, the situation in Ukraine and the gifting in kind that we've got up to, providing the Ukrainians with armor, with vehicles, with artillery systems, with shells, with all the other things we've given, as has the US, as has, you know, the rest of NATO. But what that means is that we have systems coming through now that people need to train on, but they're also they don't really have those systems because either A, they haven't been delivered, or B, they've been gifted away, which means that we've got to get those people ready to use the new systems as they come in. The new systems are Challenger 3, which is our new main battle tank, which is a development of Challenger 2, but is far more effective, far more deadly as a piece of kit than Challenger 2 was. We have Ajax, which is a reconnaissance vehicle family, which is a very large, very potent vehicle, 40mm cannon, weighing in at 43 tons of armor, able to see well over the horizon, able to use a large amount of sensors, able to communicate what it sees very quickly. It is a very potent piece of kit. Boxer, our wheeled armored vehicle, very quick, able to move around a battlefield very rapidly, able to carry people, not particularly heavily armed or armored, but able to get people from A to B, debus, and get out into the fight very quickly. And then our new artillery system, Archer, which has been developed by the Swedes and which we bought recently to replace the artillery sets that we've sent off. It is wheeled and it replaces large amounts of AS90, which was our tracked 155 artillery platform. So what we've got to do is we've got to get those people in who will use those bits of kit, trained on those bits of kit at the same time as carrying out combined arms maneuver training, at the same time as preparing to fight tonight or tomorrow morning or whenever in the next few years, should the situation around the world deteriorate and we have to go and fight anywhere. So you can see that that's quite difficult. We have this running platform of 160 odd courses teaching the very basic skills. Then we have 1,200 courses running that are teaching people, you know, just bringing them up to speed in a general sense. Then we've got combined arms maneuver training. Then we've got training going on for this transformation. And that means that all up, we have to find more effective ways. And the headquarters are working extremely hard to try and find ways of combining things so that you can have an effect in the combined arms maneuver space and at the same time in the CAM capability gap and transforming at the pace of relevance. So it's about training smarter and trying to ensure that you hit all your goals. But you can see that in the training world, that's really, really difficult. I'll leave training now and talk a little bit about our priorities in warfare branch. So we write the British Army's doctrine, and we also deliver huge amounts of what we call warfare development. Doctrine is probably good for 3 to 5 years. But at the same time, in cahoots with it, you have to have warfare development, which basically is looking forward of doctrine to the next 3 to 5 years and seeing what developments might be coming along the way. And that's the space that we work in. After that, you start to find there's concepts where people are looking to the future and saying, this is what we see on the horizon. And we have to try to think about how that might end up in doctrine in, by sort of 2030 or maybe just after. So it's kind of future gazing, but it's also firmly rooted in hardcore doctrine that we know is effective in the here and now. So our priorities in that area, you'll notice how our priorities are really tightly keyed into DLW's key themes, but our top priority at the moment is to support Op Mobilize. So you won't know because it's I think it's a UK thing, but Op Mobilize is the UK's reaction to the situation in Ukraine. It is the Chief of the General Staff's intellectual reaction that what we're going to do is we are going to be prepared to fight against the pacing threat and Russia in the next in the next 5 years. That's backed up by Commander Field Army's note how we will fight in 2026. I don't want to scare the horses. It doesn't mean we're going to fight in 2026. What that means is that we need to be prepared to be able to fight effectively as a combined arms maneuver army in 2026. So that's the sort of timescale that we've got to get into it. How do we support it? Well, we provide the intellectual underpinning for that through a series of engagements, looking at things such as command and control, fires, and lethality. So we provide the doctrine, the intellectual backing to support all the moves forward. And that's our key and number one priority. Our second priority is supporting doctrine for the new vehicle platforms. So we don't write in the UK platform-specific doctrine. What we do is we tell the army the best way to fight with a certain type. So if we were looking at an armor formation, we'll say this is the best way to fight with an armored formation, or a mechanized formation, or any variation thereof. So when we receive these vehicles, what we have to work out is what will that formation look like with those vehicles, and how best can we blend what we know to give those platforms and those formations the best possible chance of defeating an opponent. So we have formations which are, almost old-fashioned armor at the moment with Challenger 2 and Warrior, which is like Bradley, and then we're going to move to a situation with Challenger 3, but with Boxer, which is a wheeled version. So you can see that intellectually we need to engage with the difference between wheels and tracks, and also with the ability to carry out offensive operations and to and other issues. It is not without issues, and we are probably best placed to answer those questions because we have expertise in doctrine and knowledge of the best way to warfight. The next one is decision advantage. Decision advantage has become a really big deal over the last I'd say 18 months, and everybody sort of looks at this. It stems from that whole idea of, if you can make impactful decisions faster than your opponent, get inside his loop, you can force him to make mistakes. You can force him to bend to your will. And so the idea is, how do we do decision advantage? How do we ensure that our decisions are better than our opponents. And that comes down to, things like better training, better education, but it also comes down to other issues like just better process, faster process, getting rid of some of the nonsense that builds up over years of having to put in different layers of checking, etc. Removing those things, taking a bit more risk, but cutting down the time that it takes to make a decision, particularly in areas like targeting, reaching decisions faster to enable you to outperform the enemy's commander. So that is our that is where we are with decision advantage, and we are quite advanced in that. There are several lines of inquiry, and we see it in the UK, in the British Army, as being absolutely critical at the moment. Then the area that I'm working on is the area of convergence, which you'll be familiar from US Army MDO. So we arrived at this, and I always say this, and people go, "Yes, of course you did." We arrived at this from a whole different direction. We looked at the same problems that the US Army was looking at, and we arrived at our convergence doctrine in exactly the same solution, but from a different angle. So that's always a bonus, because people sort of say, well, it's got a better chance of being true if you're observing it from somewhere else. And we're writing stuff constantly on this, and we will be including it in our doctrine next year, talking about what convergence is. There's a huge amount of confusion across our army, I think across all armies, about what does multi-domain operations mean. And I was saying the other day, and I think it's best put and really simple, in that multi-domain operations are those operations which take effects created in other domains other than the land domain and pull them into the land domain, organize them, synchronize them, and ensure that they support combined arms maneuver at the tactical level. So that is basically all that there is to MDO. But as with most new concepts, people like to own them and try and be experts in them, and they tend to change as a result. So you ask any 10 generals what MDO means, and you get 10 different definitions, because it is all things to all men. What we're trying to do is we're trying to knock 9 of those definitions out, and try and bring a degree of standardization in explanation, if not in thinking. Another important area that I work in is our role with joint doctrine and with allies. You'll have heard Paul mention at the beginning that I'm the secretary of the Senior Land Doctrine Panel of NATO's Land Operations Working Group. What that means is that all maneuver doctrine, all operations doctrine on land comes through our panel for all 30 odd members of NATO. And so what we do is we write it, we review it, and we pass it around and get it ratified. That doctrine then largely becomes the governing doctrine for the entire alliance. So it's really important, and it means that you have to have really good relationships with your allies, and also with the parts thereof. So we have to have good relationships with US Marine Corps and the US Army on the land side, but we also have to have and enjoy really good relationships with our European partners, particularly the Germans, the French, the Norwegians, the Dutch, and the Italians, who tend to be the driving force for alongside the UK, Canada, and the US in land doctrine in NATO. I also work on I chair the panel that looks at maneuver doctrine for ABCANs. So US Marine Corps is part of ABCANs. ABCANs is basically a group of the armies or the land forces of the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, the Five Eyes community, and we have joint doctrine of our own. Interesting for the US Marine Corps, we are about to start developing, if we can get the clearance for it, a new doctrine looking at the land contribution to the littoral environment. This is a real jump. We recognize the importance of it, bearing in mind the pacing threat and the situations that we see growing in the South China Sea, etc. That armies will have to be involved there. Land forces will have to be involved, and we need to understand what is different about the littoral environment from other environments, and so how do we prepare for that? How do we prepare for that fight? So that's really interesting. That'll be a key point of our work next year in the maneuver project team. So, but as you can see, so we have those relationships. We have relationships with other organisations. Another one is called Finabel, which is the group of European armies. They have some great meetings each year, and we get around to discuss, some very future, some futuristic thinking. It's a great place to get people to come and chat. So that is Finabel. So we have that international piece that we're working on, and also we have to engage. We've got to find ways. I think this is probably something that all armed forces do. We've got to find ways of getting the doctrine and getting the thinking out there to people so they can engage with it, learn it, and be able to express it. And so we have a thing called BDTL, Bringing Doctrine to Life, which are small videos which talk about the different parts of doctrine. We have about 20 small videos on urban warfare, for instance, which take elements of each urban piece and use them as teaching aims, but also just as information. Interestingly, over COVID, a lot of units were using those little videos because when you couldn't go out and train, or you couldn't put people together, you could tell people to watch a video. It is not the same as training, but what it is it is an assistant to training. It's an assistant to education, and so that is essentially what we in Warfare Branch are tied into specifically at the moment. I'm just going to check my notes over and see if I've missed anything that I wanted to talk about. So that's a pretty wide-ranging thing, I think you'll agree. It talks about the size of Land Warfare Centre, what we do, why we do it, some of the problems that we face and how we're trying to overcome them as a centre, and our priorities, the things that are really important to us. And it was at the ABCANS meeting, in actual fact, that I came up and popped in at Quantico to see Paul, to talk to him. So it's all about engagement and talking about the way that we're developing in terms of warfare development, and that's what this is about. So that's about it from me, and I'll pass back to Paul, I think. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. That was a lot of really good information. So I've got a couple of follow-up questions just listening to you talk here. And then for those in the chat, if you have any, just go ahead and type them into the chat and we'll get to them as we go. So one of the questions I had, I was going to make a comment about the bringing doctrine to life. I know that's kind of one of the things that some folks in the Marine Corps, at least at a smaller level, have looked at. How do we take a big concept like doctrine and put it down to a level that's more understandable and more digestible? I know the U.S. Army has looked at creating smaller publications that basically hit the wave tops of doctrine. And then if you find something that you want to know more about, it gives you a link to, a different publication that goes far more in depth into that item. So I think, famously, it's usually attributed to like a German general or a Soviet general saying, the U.S. military is impossible to fight because you can't practice their doctrine because they don't read their own doctrine. So their doctrine is chaos, which, I don't think is accurate, but it still makes me laugh. So the first question I had is, how much is shared between, school-wise and training-wise between the different services that you have there in the UK. We have a lot of schools that, the EOD school is a great example. It's run by the Navy, but all U.S. EOD personnel go to that school. So how much of that is the case for you guys over in the UK?
Yeah, so let me think. So Erwin Rommel famously said that the British Army had the best doctrine in the world. It's lucky for the Germans that no one ever bothers to read it. And so we come from that position. So the first point I'd probably make is that yes, we are in the same position as everybody, looking to find things like BDTL, like podcasts, like going out to units to talk to them, just to try and get people engaged with the doctrine. And I wrote a doctrine primer about 35 pages about a year ago, which has been quite successful. It designed not to talk in depth, but to talk about just to talk about the wave top stuff, just to get people engaged and move them on to other stuff. So that is our approach in terms of joint doctrine. So most of our joint doctrine is run by our Development Concepts and Doctrine Centre, which is based at Shrivenham, which is about 40 miles from where we are. What we find is that some of the centres that the army is working with in terms of doctrine and the training is already joint. Much of it is joint. So the training at the policing, administration, logistic training is all joint. And although each arm will probably have its own doctrine, the doctrine is pretty tightly tied up because largely we've adopted NATO doctrine, which means that the whole force is operating on something almost the same or very similar. So I think we're probably in the same boat as you are in the US, which is some people train together. But I think perhaps where we are a little bit further forward, maybe, is that by adopting the NATO doctrine across the board, it means that all three services are probably teaching and thinking about the problem in the same way. Whereas I know, obviously, US Army doctrine, Navy and Air Force and Marine Corps doctrine are sometimes a little different. And I don't know the degree to which you follow NATO doctrine, Paul. So that might be an issue.
Well, I think yeah, no, I think that would be one of my questions, because you said you work a lot with NATO. So if your doctrine is more closely aligned with NATO, then it makes that integration easier. I think for us, what I've seen is, I think a great example is the planning process, right? The Air Force has their own planning process. The Marine Corps has their own planning process. The Army has theirs. And then when you go to NATO, NATO has its own planning process. Y'all have the 7 questions. So
yeah. we now large parts of NATO planning process have been adopted wholesale into Army planning. So what that means is that we are interoperable. I mean, one of the things that I'm trying to do with ABCANS is to just get the 2 non-members of ABCANS to accept a wholesale NATO doctrine, because instead of having 30 allies on board, you suddenly have 32, 33, 34, 35 allies all using the same doctrine. To me, it just seems really sensible. What we have to do, though, is we have to improve the standard of the NATO doctrine to bring it to a point where other nations are happy to accept it, and that's hard work. But I think I believe that's the answer. If the NATO doctrine was good enough that it could be read by the US Air Force or whatever, and they looked at it and went, "This is good," then if we could all adopt the same doctrine, therefore we would all fight the same way, and commanders would know what to expect when receiving a formation. So I think it's absolutely key. This whole idea of interoperability is absolutely key, and standardization is absolutely key. And I don't think it's a weakness in terms of not like critical weakness, but I think it is a weakness that across the board we have different doctrine. We have a standard caliber for artillery, for instance, in NATO at 155, but every nation makes its own 155, and I think there's 9 versions of 155 in NATO, and not every one can be fired from every 155 gun because of the nature of the differences. So it's a problem, isn't it? But I think if we don't get after interoperability and standardization, I think we're in we're placing ourselves in an artificial disadvantage against our opponents, whose artillery at 152 millimeter is kind of very standard. In fact, so standard that it can be shipped across the world from one continent to another and fired out of different guns. So I think I know that's getting into the weeds of capability. I think the understanding amongst amongst NATO is particularly good, but I think it's probably the same. We need to be able to reach down, particularly to the newer countries that are joining, to ensure that how they fight is how we fight, so that people have expectations that people are going to fight in the same or in a known way, so that you can take account of differences, etc. Especially over such a huge alliance, which covers most of the Western world. We need to have that understanding. So that would be my point, I think.
Awesome. Yeah. So we'll go to the first question in the chat here. So Ian asks, have you been incorporating wargaming, artificial or AR, VR, and other methods of dynamic training and learning into your training education and or doctrinal development?
Certainly have. Of late, in fact, yesterday we had a briefing. We were talking to the Integrated Warfare Conference, which was a conference of Army, Navy, Air Force, and Strategic Command, looking at how we can really drive in more wargaming. The UK has just set up a joint wargaming centre at Southwark Park. For those of you with a historical bent, you'll recognise that Southwark Park was Eisenhower's headquarters before D-Day, and indeed in a building adjacent to the new wargaming centre is the room that Ike made the fateful decision to launch the invasion of Europe from, and it's laid out beautifully with large maps, etc. So ideal place to have the wargaming centre. Very interconnected, war games of different sorts, simulation of different sorts, looking at ways to war game everything we do, using all the available technologies to enable us to sort of understand how we fight and how we should fight and learn lessons from it in a simulated sense. And we have areas of simulation expertise within Land Warfare Centre as well. So both at the joint level and where we are, we're very keen on wargaming and use wargaming intimately. In fact, there was only a war game looking at logistics 2 weeks ago in our branch, and we had a very major war game on a domain level warfare last year. We probably have wargaming happens on a monthly basis, covering a different subject. So wargaming is really critical and increasingly important across defence, but not just with the army, but wholly across defence. So yeah, it's a growth area.
Yeah, I was in London this summer, and we got a brief from DSTL, the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory, for those not in the UK. And one of the things that we were talking about was wargaming. They tend to look at wargaming more in the sense of future concepts, the experimental type of wargaming. Whereas here at Marine Corps University, we're looking at more of the experiential or learning style of war games. So it's interesting to see the different aspects all come together.
Yeah, what is interesting there, Paul, is that yes, for DSTL, because they are looking at future. Their element tends to be future based. But if you look at what we're doing, ours tends to be the now, because we're working in doctrine. So we tend to be testing our doctrine against a problem or a problem set, and doing a bit of warfare development, saying what if you use this instead. So it's kind of testing the now to get it ready for the future. That's where we are. Whereas the STL are very much looking at the future and looking back towards where we are. So it's trying to create that seamless gap between how we fight today and how we'll fight in 2030, say.
Yeah, and I think that leads well into Albert's question. And he said, since Ajax got mentioned, how have the delays and safety issues with Ajax affected the ability to test or experiment with Ajax and hence incorporate its abilities into doctrinal development? And I know you said you guys don't do type model specific doctrine, you do more generic doctrine, but how has those effects gone into your doctrinal development?
So yeah, I mean, it would be disingenuous to say that it didn't have any effect, but the time that was spent ironing out the problems, and the problems are the same with any platform, aren't they? Ironing out the problems was actually in the production and development time, so hasn't really been into the time of or to not such a huge degree, the time of doctrine development, etc. So we've been working on sort of armored cavalry doctrine and how that might be changed or need to be changed by having that recce vehicle as opposed to our old-fashioned recce vehicles, and what the effect might be. We've been able to work on the doctrine because we've had, the platform, we've known the capabilities of the platform. You can work on that sort of thing, and in the same way as we discussed with the STL, with future simulations. So and to be fair, for the people who are going to use it, I was down there with the head of CAD, US Army CAD, in January, when they were in the middle of sort of a program of working out some of the problems, and I had some very frank conversations with some junior soldiers. They may not talk to officers, but they will speak to me. And they told me that as far as they were concerned, that was probably the finest piece of kit they'd ever been in. And they were using that, trialing it at Bovington, which is where they do all the trials. They were saying, how exceptional it was, how it performed, how easy it was to use and maintain. So it had such positive things that, in actual fact, they have been able to carry out these tests and some development work on it. It has slowed it up. Of course, it's not as it would have been had there been a smooth process, but they've learned huge amounts, and we're absorbing those things into our doctrine, not on a platform specific basis, but in terms of how you might use this differently from our lighter vehicle system. So, our current recce vehicle, or the rear recce vehicle that's going out of service now, weighs in at about 8 tons, and fits neatly between rows of trees. It's a very tiny little thing. The whole family, designed in the 60s and 70s, a highly effective little recce vehicle. Whereas this is 43 tons, much larger, doesn't fit in the same places, but is far more lethal, and also far more likely to get information. So what you have to do with the doctrine is you have to take the lessons from the lethality, and you have to and the lessons in terms of what it can pick up in terms of in terms of recce and information, and work out how you're going to use that and how that might change the doctrine. So I think from a doctrinal perspective, didn't really have any effect on the delay. In terms of training, of course, and that's why we rapidly have to catch up. So that's really the effect of Ajax and the problems with it.
So I think I've got one last question, and I think that's what we have time for. And I'm kind of going to roll it into Albert's last question here. So, you had talked about, one of the lines of effort there for the center was closing that combined arms capability gap. One of the things that I wrote down was, we talk about it as a near peer fight. You mentioned, we spent the last 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. That fight is very different than the fight that we're seeing in Ukraine. So, as we push towards this near peer fight, and then a month ago, Gaza happens. And so now we're looking at, okay, well, they're still in a regular fight to do. So Albert's question, so mine is, how is the UK kind of looking at that, a combination of what we would call a near peer fight and irregular warfare? And Albert, his question was, what is the process for incorporating lessons learned or observations for ongoing conflicts like Ukraine and Gaza? What does it look like doing for doctrinal experimentation, and how quickly can you incorporate new observations?
Okay, so we have the full range of irregular warfare doctrine that came out of 20 years of COIN, and we have that working alongside the developments in combined arms maneuver in that training and in terms of the doctrine. Of course, combined arms maneuver is just as useful in situations like Gaza, and we see, without judging it too quickly and deciding, we see some highly effective use of combined arms in that urban situation, that urban environment. So already I think we can all see that there are lessons popping up. Lessons popped out of Ukraine very quickly. The biggest lesson out of Ukraine was probably that it looks very much like we expected things to look in the back end of the Cold War. That's the sort of fight that we were all expecting. We were all trained for that, and our doctrine, whilst having to be adapted because nothing stays the same, was largely kind of fit for purpose. In terms of what comes out of Gaza, we'll see. But we have fit for purpose irregular warfare doctrine. We have an AFM irregular warfare, Army Field Manual irregular warfare, and we have Army Field Manual conventional warfare. And the two of them are kept completely up to date as we go. Indeed, we meet with NATO in Slovakia in the next month, and one of the subjects there is to have a look again at the COIN tactics manual for NATO, and that will probably absorb some of the lessons from Gaza. Now, the lessons process is a subject that I could go on about for hours, but we're extremely lucky with our lessons exploitation center. They are constantly gathering lessons using our intelligence community, but also open source stuff to see where changes in warfare can be seen, and seeing if we're looking at a trend. Because obviously you can observe something, but it might just be an individual one-off. What we're looking for is trends. That's where lessons can be got. And as soon as those lessons are got, then we talk with our lessons people on a daily basis, and then we can think about whether we need to absorb it into the doctrine. And so I think we have a really highly effective process, which is, here's the doctrine to start us off. What is lessons saying? What are the lessons of history, so historical lessons? What are we learning on exercise? What are we learning from conflicts? What are we learning from our own deployments? Feed all that back in, and we have a judgment panel that sits on a quarterly basis to sort of say, what do we think we're seeing, and how does that affect doctrine? And then we are prepared to change the doctrine according to what we see. And that's about agility in writing doctrine. And doctrine has, in the last 3 years, become much more agile. So 3 years ago, when I started writing ADP land operations, doctrine was basically something that was looked at every 5 years. You rewrote it if you needed to. You adopted a different style if you needed to, but largely the content would stay the same. Today, that is not the case. We start with the doctrine that's there. We only change the bits we need to change, but we are not afraid to change the bits wholesale where it has become apparent, both historically, operationally, in the wider sense, that things have changed. So I think it's much more agile than it was, and certainly we are not afraid to change doctrine when we need to. Hence the adoption of convergence, which is a huge step forward, I think, for the British Army, for UK defence. But we know we had to make it because, everyone is observing the benefits of taking effects created in space, cyberspace, the electromagnetic spectrum, and ensuring that they are fed in to how we fight in a conventional sense as a tactical level combined arms maneuver.
Yeah, I'll probably get beat up when I leave my cubicle later, but our defining publication, Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication 1, Warfighting, was first published in '89 and updated in 1997, and we haven't really changed it since then. I've seen arguments for and against, so I'll get beat up later. But
yeah, I was just going to say that we effectively review ours every 5 years. So, for instance, to give you some dates, I think our first set of doctrine, because we didn't have doctrine in the same sense as you did until the late 1980s, early 1990s. And then we went into a 5-year scale. And so the last time before last that it was reviewed, ADP Land Ops reviewed in 2017, rewritten in 2022, and I will be rewriting part of it in 2024 as a direct result of lessons from other conflicts and the stuff we're doing on convergence. So I think it's much more agile, and I dare say, I don't, your doctrine is a fine piece of work, and it may well be that everything in it can remain the same, but everything can always do with another look.
So I think that's going to be most of the time we have for today. I did want to give you a few moments, sir, for any closing comments, if you had any, before I close it out.
Thank you, Paul. No, not really. I'd just like to thank everybody for listening in, and I hope that that's been helpful in understanding how the UK works, or the UK Army works, on its doctrine development, on its training, on preparing for warfare in the future. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your time, your insight. Also, thank you to those who have joined us today in the chat. That's all we have for this episode, so go ahead and carry out the plan of the day. Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you have enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.